Part 3. Creating New Identities, circa 750 to 900. The years between about 750 and 900 mark another turning point in the shaping of medieval civilization. If in the period 600-750 we saw the emergence of three sibling cultures, Western Christendom, Byzantium, and Islam, then in the following century and a half, we see those siblings begin to craft distinctive identities with new political forms, new cultural patterns, and sharper boundaries. Each civilization builds on the foundations of late antiquity, but each reinterprets them in unique ways. Western Europe, under the Carolingians, develops a new model of Christian kingship and empire. Byzantium survives military pressures and intense religious controversy, emerging with a more defined orthodoxy and orthodox identity. The Islamic world, now fragmented politically, produces multiple centers of power, including the striking independent Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba. These years are not yet the high Middle Ages of the cathedrals and crusades, but they are the formative centuries in which the medieval world's identities were hammered out. In Western Europe, the defining development is the rise of the Carolingians. By the middle of the 8th century, the Merovingian kings were kings in name only, with real power in the hands of the aristocratic officials known as the mayors of the palace. In 751, Pepin the Short made a decisive move. He deposed the last Merovingian and had himself anointed king, with the explicit blessing of the Pope. This moment is worth pausing on, because it marks the creation of a new political identity. Kingship was no longer simply a matter of inheritance or military prowess. It was a sacred office, legitimized by the church. Pepin reinforced this alliance by defeating the Lombards in Italy and donating conquered territories to the papacy, creating the papal states. In this transaction, we see the pattern of medieval Western politics, rulers and popes tied together in a bond of mutual support and sometimes mutual rivalry. The Carolingian achievement reached its height under Charlemagne, who reigned from 768 to 814. Charlemagne was a formidable warrior, expanding Frankish power through campaigns against the Saxons in northern Germany, the Lombards in Italy, and Muslim forces beyond the Pyrenees. His empire came to encompass most of Western and Central Europe, from the Atlantic to the Elbe, and from the Pyrenees to central Italy. Yet Charlemagne was more than a conqueror. He sought to govern effectively through the use of written capitularies, through the dispatch of royal envoys known as missi dominici, and through the cultivation of close ties with bishops and abbots. He presided over church councils, enforced Christian practice, and insisted on uniformity in liturgy. At Aachen, his capital, he gathered scholars like Alcuin of York, who spearheaded the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning that emphasized the copying of classical and Christian texts, the standardization of Latin, and the creation of a new clear script, Carolingian minuscule. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. The symbolism was immense. It declared that Western Christendom had its own empire, separate from Byzantium, and that the legacy of Rome lived on in a Christian king. The act also deepened the bond between Pope and Emperor, though not without tension. The Byzantines regarded the title as a usurpation, since they still considered themselves the true Roman emperors. But for Western Europe, the coronation of Charlemagne created a new imperial identity, one that combined Christian sanctity, Roman tradition, and Germanic kingship. The empire that Charlemagne created, however, proved fragile. After his death, his son Louis the Pious struggled to maintain unity. Civil wars among Louis's sons culminated in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divided the empire into three parts: West Francia, East Francia, and a central strip known as Lotharingia. These divisions laid the groundwork for the later kingdoms of France and Germany. But they also revealed the difficulty of sustaining a vast empire in a society still rooted on local loyalties. Nobles grew more independent and royal authority often depended on personal relationships and negotiated alliances. Yet even as the Carolingian political order fragmented, the identity of Western Christendom had been reshaped. Kings were now seen as sacred rulers. The church was deeply integrated into governance, and monastic networks underpinned literacy and piety. The British Isles shared in this transformation as well. In England, the heptarchy of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms saw shifting balances of power. Northumbria, Mercia, and eventually Wessex vied for dominance. Christianity deepened its roots, and monasteries like Lindisfarne and Jarrow became centers of learning. The Venerable Bede, who died in 735, left behind a vision of an English church united in faith and culture. By the later 9th century, Wessex under Alfred the Great would emerge as the leading kingdom, resisting Viking invasions and promoting vernacular learning. Ireland, too, with its powerful monasteries, contributed missionaries and texts that shaped continental Christianity. The creation of Christian kingship, the spread of learning, and the resilience against outside pressure all defined insular identities, that is, English identities, in this centuries. Meanwhile, the Iberian Peninsula was being transformed by the arrival of Islam. In 711, Muslim armies had defeated the Visigoths and rapidly conquered most of the peninsula. By 756, the Umayyad prince Abd al-Rahman established himself as the emir of Cordoba, independent from the Abbasid caliphates in Baghdad. This made Al-Andalus the first Islamic polity to assert full independence from the Eastern Caliphate. The Emirate of Cordoba grew into one of the most sophisticated societies of medieval Europe. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, begun under Abd al-Rahman, symbolized the permanence of Muslim rule. The city itself became a hub of culture and trade. Yet Al-Andalus was not homogeneous. Arab and Berber settlers sometimes clashed, while Christians and Jews, as dhimmis, lived under conditions of protection but also subordination. Many Christians, called Mossadabs, adopted Arabic language and customs while maintaining their faith, creating a hybrid identity. In this way, Iberia became a laboratory of convivencia, or coexistence, and contestation in which multiple cultures shape one another. In the Christian north of Spain, small kingdoms like Asturias held out against Muslim expansion. Under rulers like Alfonso II, they developed their own identities, reviving the old Visigothic law code to claim continuity with pre-Islamic Spain, and sponsoring the cult of St. James at Compostela, which soon became a major pilgrimage site. Farther east, the Carolingians created the Spanish March, a defensive buffer that included Barcelona. Over time, this march would develop into Catalonia, with its own distinctive legal and political culture. Thus, Iberia, fractured between a powerful Muslim emirate and small Christian states, became a frontier of identity formation, a region where religion, law, and political ambition intersected to create new paths forward. Now, Byzantium, during these same centuries, faced both external attack and internal religious controversy. The empire had survived the shocks of the 7th century, but now entered a new phase of self-definition. Militarily, the Byzantines resisted Arab advances, holding on to Asia Minor and the Balkans, and preserving Constantinople against repeated sieges. Administratively, the theme system, the division of the empire into military districts, allowed for more localized defense and governance. Culturally, the great debate of the 8th and 9th centuries was iconoclasm. Emperors like Leo III and Constantine V rejected the veneration of icons, seeing it as idolatry. Monks and many lay people, however, defended icons as windows to the divine. This conflict was bitter, involving councils, persecutions, and the theological treatises. When icons were finally restored to veneration in 843, the outcome defined Byzantine orthodoxy. The insistence on the legitimacy of icons became a badge of identity, marking Byzantium off from both Islam, which prohibited images, and from the Latin West, which had not experienced iconoclasm in the same way. At the same time, Byzantium engaged in missionary work that extended its influence in Eastern Europe. Missionaries like Cyril and Methodius translated the Bible into Slavic languages and created the Cyrillic alphabet, bringing Christianity to the Slavs and linking them culturally to Byzantium. This expansion of Orthodox Christianity eastward was another way Byzantium defined itself, not just by what it resisted, but by what it created. Its identity was imperial, Orthodox, and Greek-speaking, and by 900, that identity was firmly established. Lastly, the Islamic world also experienced major changes in these centuries. In 750, the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads and moved the caliphal capital from Damascus to Baghdad. The Abbasids presented themselves as more inclusive, drawing on Persian traditions and sponsoring a brilliant cultural flowering. Baghdad became one of the great cities of the world, home to the House of Wisdom, where Greek, Persian, and even Indian texts were translated into Arabic. Scholars like Al-Khwarizmi advanced mathematics, and physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina advanced medicine. Philosophers like Al-Farabi and later Averroes engaged with Aristotle. The Abbasid Caliphate, however, was never able to maintain full political control over its vast empire. Regional rulers asserted autonomy, most famously the Umayyads in Cordoba. But culturally, the Abbasid era was formative, producing the intellectual and artistic traditions that would shape Islamic identity for centuries. By 900, then, the three sibling cultures had crystallized. In Western Europe, the Carolingians had defined kingship and as sacred and imperial, even if their empire fragmented after Charlemagne. In Iberia, Islam established a permanent presence, with Cordoba as a dazzling independent emirate, while small Christian states forged their own counter-identities. Byzantium resisted air pressure, defined orthodoxy through the resolution of iconoclasm, and expanded its missionary reach in Eastern Europe. Islam had fractured politically, but blossomed culturally, creating centers of learning from Baghdad to Cordoba. The theme that unites all of this is identity making. Each civilization between 750 and 900 asked and answered the question, who are we? Western Europe answered by saying we are the heirs of Rome, baptized into Christ, ruled by sacred kings. Byzantium answered by saying we are the true empire, orthodox and imperial, defenders of icons and missionaries to the Slavs. Islam answered by saying we are the community of the one God, universal, cosmopolitan, with centers of power that could stretch from Spain to Persia. These answers did not end the questions. Indeed, the rest of the medieval history that we will see will continue to wrestle with them. But they established the frameworks within which these questions were asked. By the end of the 9th century, the medieval world as we know it had taken shape. It was not united, it was not defined, but it was defined, I guess I should say, yeah. Western Christendom, Byzantium, and Islam were now distinct civilizations, siblings with shared ancestry, but defined different destinies. The interactions through war, trade and diplomacy, and culture would drive the history of the Middle Ages. The identities forged between 750 and 900 were not temporary adjustments, they were lasting foundations. Out of them would grow the Europe of kings, popes, cathedrals, and crusades, universities, and parliaments. The Byzantium of Orthodox emperors and missionaries, and Islam of caliphates, scholars, and poets. The centuries ahead would see conflict and collaboration, but the basic shapes of medieval identity were already in place.